Thank you very much. If you're not familiar with the National Churchill Museum, it used to be called the Winston Churchill Memorial and Library, and there are some brochures out on the table. We'd love to see you in Fulton. And of course, it is in Fulton because of the so-called Iron Curtain speech, which will have its 70th anniversary next March. More on that in a minute. It's always good to be back in Independence. 30 years ago, I would have been in a park ranger outfit uniform, giving tours over at the Truman home. I was a rising junior in college, and senior, I guess. It was a very busy summer because that was the second summer the Truman home had been opened. And anyway, so I've been doing research and am familiar with the Truman home and Truman Library for 31 years now. So it's always good to be back here, and I'm a Kansas Citian by birth. So I was asked, as Brian said, to give an introductory comments, remarks, brief history about the antecedents to the UN and maybe a little bit about its early days. At least that's what I took to be the mission. So as you know, some of this will be familiar, but I'm going to draw an arc basically from the Atlantic Charter of 1941 to the Iron Curtain speech in 1946. And I hope that will make sense in the next 20 minutes or so. Of course, Americans have always had rather strong and mixed feelings about international cooperation, going back at least to George Washington's farewell address, which I'm sure you all remember studying in school, and his warning against America becoming involved in entangling alliances with Europe. Well, of course, that really was the dominant foreign policy mandate for probably in some ways even today to some people. But it helps explain a lot about how or why the United States had to be dragged into World War I several years after it had already been going. And then again, being dragged into World War II by the Japanese more than 2 years after the war started. So, it's teaching college students and Americans in general, we don't often remember that the war didn't start when the United States came into it. But regardless of that, the World War II was seen universally as a failure of the League of Nations, and I'm not going to do a history of the League of Nations, but it was, of course, an effort after World War I to avoid another war by having a United Nations organization of sorts. But of course, we all know that the League of Nations failed to prevent the Italians and Ethiopia and then later, of course, Nazi Germany from doing what it did. So early in the war, Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, even before the United States was in the war, they met in Newfoundland. And on August 14th, 1941, they issued a statement which has become known as the Atlantic Charter. It wasn't known that at the time. It was just a joint statement. It was not it wasn't an official document. It looks more like a press release from the time. If you go to the Truman Library, you see plenty of these mimeographed things on the pulpy brown paper that was available in World War II. But it has become known as the Atlantic Charter because it set the goals for the post-war world. Already before the U.S. was in the war, Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt were thinking about the post-war world. And the Atlantic Charter inspired many of the international agreements that have happened since then, the United Nations being one of them, but plenty of others. So it was issued as a statement. There was no ratification. It's not a treaty. The Senate didn't ratify it. It's just a statement. So for what it was, it had a pretty profound effect. But one of its weaknesses was that Roosevelt, in his way, could be as non-specific as he wanted to be about what he thought it meant, and Churchill could, of course, interpret it later in the war the way he wanted it to be interpreted. So there was a fair amount of disagreement from the beginning about what it meant. But just to refresh your memory, the 8 principal points of the Charter were that there would be no the United States or the United Kingdom would not seek territorial gains as a result of the war. The second point was that territorial adjustments must be in accord with the wishes of the people concerned. And the third, perhaps the most controversial, was that all people had a right to self-determination. And fourth, trade barriers were to be lowered. Fifth was there was to be global economic cooperation and advancement of social welfare. The sixth point was that the participants would work for a world free of want and fear, echoing Roosevelt's 4 freedoms. And the seventh was that the participants would work for freedom of the seas. And the final point was that there was to be disarmament of aggressor nations and a post-war common disarmament. So you can see there are lots of antecedents to those points and lots of things that we are still arguing about internationally from the Atlantic Charter. It was quickly and widely endorsed by the Allied nations and leading organizations in 1941. At subsequent meetings of what was called the Inter-Allied Council in London in September, the governments in exile of Belgium, Czechoslovakia, Greece, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, and Yugoslavia, as well as the Soviet Union and representatives of the Free French forces, unanimously endorsed or adopted the adherence to the common principles of the policies set forth in the Atlantic Charter. So it really became for the Allies a charter document to guide them through the war and then into the post-war world. The problems came not from Germany and Japan, though, but from those of the Allies that had empires and which resisted self-determination, especially Britain, the Soviet Union, and the Netherlands. Initially, it appeared that Roosevelt and Churchill had agreed that the third point of the Charter was not, that's the self-determination clause, was not going to apply to Africa and Asia, where most of the European colonial colonies were. However, Roosevelt's speechwriter Robert Sherwood noted that, quote, "It was not long before the people of India, Burma, Malaya, and Indonesia were beginning to ask if the Atlantic Charter extended also to the Pacific and to Asia in general." With a war that could only be won with these allies, Roosevelt's solution was to put some pressure on Britain, but to postpone until after the war the issue of self-determination of the colonies. That's, to me, typical Rooseveltian. Let's save that issue for another day. And meanwhile, Churchill is trying to cling very determinedly to the British Empire as it's falling apart during World War II. You may know his famous quotation about he didn't become the King's Prime Minister to oversee the dissolution of the British Empire. So self-determination was one of the sticking points almost immediately. The Americans insisted that the Charter was to acknowledge that the war was being fought to ensure self-determination, while the British were forced to agree to these aims. But on the other hand, Churchill would make speeches where he would say that the Charter was only meant to apply to states under German occupation, and certainly not to the peoples who formed part of the British Empire. So in a sense, he was taking Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation approach. It only applied to rebel-held territories. Mohandas Gandhi wrote to President Roosevelt in 1942, "I venture to think that the Allied declaration that the Allies are fighting to make the world safe for the freedom of the individual and for democracy sounds hollow so long as India, and for that matter Africa, are exploited by Great Britain." So during the war, this is a very thorny issue that Roosevelt and Churchill continued to disagree about. And it came up again with Poland, and also after the Soviet Union occupied the Baltic states. Churchill argued for an interpretation of the charter that would allow the Soviet Union to control the Baltic states, but the United States objected to that interpretation. And Lord Beaverbrook warned that the Atlantic Charter, quote, would be a menace to the Britain's own safety as well as to that of the Soviet Union. So the point I'm trying to make is while the Atlantic Charter set out some wonderful principles, it was by no means in and of itself an enforceable document or a clear one that could guide the Allies after the war. So, through all the wartime conferences, Tehran, Yalta, Potsdam, where Truman shows up on the scene, there are these questions of what the post-war world would look like. And as you've just heard, in the spring and summer of 1945, there was a conference in San Francisco that created what we know of as the United Nations. I'm sure members of the association probably have these principles memorized, but I thought I would just refresh our memories of the Charter of the United Nations passed in 1945. Its preamble says that we, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights and the dignity and worth of the human person and the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small, and to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, and to promote social progress and better standards of life and larger freedom, and for these ends to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors, and to unite our strength to maintain international peace and security, and to ensure by the acceptance of principles and the institution of methods that armed force shall not be used, save in the common interest, and to employ international machinery for the promotion of the economic and social advancement of all peoples, have resolved to combine our efforts to accomplish these aims, and that was through the United Nations. Article 1 declares the purposes of the United Nations. Quickly, there's 4 of them: to maintain international peace and security, and to that end to take effective collective measures for the prevention and removal of threats to the peace and for the suppression of acts of aggression or other breaches of the peace, and to bring about by peaceful means and in conformity with the principles of justice and international law adjustment or settlement of international disputes or situations which might lead to a breach of the peace. The second is to develop friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, and to take other appropriate measures to strengthen universal peace. The third purpose of the UN is to achieve international cooperation in solving international problems of an economic, social, cultural, or humanitarian character, and in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion, and to be a center for harmonizing the actions of nations in the attainment of these common ends. So Harry Truman's challenge after Roosevelt's death and the UN conferences quickly on the horizon is to keep the Soviet Union in the UN. There were blustering about whether the Soviet Union would participate, and of course it became one of the permanent members of the Security Council, and it was seen by everybody involved that if the Soviet Union didn't join, that the UN would not be effective. So in those early months of his presidency, one of Truman's challenges, as much as he disliked some of the Soviet officials, was to strike a balance and to do whatever he could, whatever the United States could do. And so at Potsdam, for instance, he and Churchill continued to struggle while Truman is struggling to keep the Soviet Union happy enough to participate in the UN. Churchill is struggling to keep the United Kingdom relevant. Throughout the war, he saw a post-war world that Britain would be vastly weakened, and so one of his goals was to use the UN and the relationship with the United States to prevent, as he would sometimes say, the little British donkey from being overshadowed by the United States and the Soviet Union or anybody else after the war. So the United Nations Charter was adopted, and of course the devil in the 70 years since has been in the details and working it all out. I wanted to end my 20 minutes or so with the end of the arc, because of course Churchill was voted out of office during the Potsdam Conference in late July 1945, and out of office he is even more powerless to protect British interests and to play in the international summit game of shaping what this new organization would be like, what the relationship with the United States would be like. So since we're here in Missouri, and he came to Missouri at the invitation of President Truman, he was looking for a forum to speak out to the world. Westminster College invited him. He accepted with Truman's endorsement of the invitation. His address at Westminster College on March 5th, 1946, is usually known as the Iron Curtain speech, because immediately it was portrayed as a sort of warmongering, alarmist, anti-Soviet declaration by Winston Churchill. But he actually entitled it "The Sinews of Peace," because to him it was his vision of how the United Nations, in particular the United States and the United Kingdom, could work together to ensure that the United Nations and other cooperative world bodies would succeed. Later in 1946, just as an aside, he gave a speech in Zurich, Switzerland. The two most significant speeches of 1946 for him were those two, Fulton and Zurich. And it was in Zurich that he later became essentially the European Union. So in that year of 1946, he was thinking of ways to structurally unite Europe to avoid conflict and have cooperation, but also to strengthen the ties between the United States and the United Kingdom that had worked so well in World War II. So I'd just like to read you a few excerpts from the Iron Curtain speech, and I hope you'll see what I mean and how he is playing off of the UN to promote his idea of what the sinews of peace, what post-war peace, how we can achieve that. He said, "I have, however, a definite and practical proposal to make for action. Courts and magistrates may be set up, but they cannot function without sheriffs and constables. The United Nations organization must immediately begin to be equipped with an international armed force. In such a matter, we can only go step by step, but we must begin now. I propose that each of the powers and states should be invited to delegate a certain number of air squadrons to the service of the World Organization. These squadrons would be trained and prepared in their own countries, but would move around in rotation from one country to another. They would wear the uniform of their own countries, but with different badges. They would not be required to act against their own nation, but in other respects they would be directed by the World Organization. This might be started on a modest scale and would grow as confidence grew. I wished to see this done after the First World War, and I devoutly trust it may be done forthwith." So already he's thinking in the terms of UN peacekeeping forces, NATO, those kinds of military bodies. And later in the speech he says, "We must never cease to proclaim in fearless tones the great principles of freedom and the rights of man, which are the joint inheritance of the English-speaking world, and which through Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, the habeas corpus, trial by jury, and the English common law, find their most famous expression in the American Declaration of Independence. All this means that the people of any country have the right and should have the power by constitutional action, by free, unfettered elections with secret ballot, to choose or change the character or form of government under which they dwell, that freedom of speech and thought should reign, that courts of justice, independent of the executive, unbiased by any party, should administer laws which have received the broad assent of large majorities or are consecrated by time and custom. Here are the title deeds of freedom which should lie in every cottage home. Here is the message of the British and American peoples to mankind. Let us preach what we practice. Let us practice what we preach. A little bit later, he says, I come to the crux of what I have traveled here to say. Neither the sure prevention of war nor the continuous rise of world organization will be gained without what I have called the fraternal association of the English-speaking peoples. This means a special relationship between the British Commonwealth and Empire and the United States. This is no time for generalities, and I will venture to be precise. Fraternal association requires not only the growing friendship and mutual understanding between our two vast but kindred systems of society, but the continuance of the intimate relationship between our military advisors, leading to common study of potential dangers, the similarity of weapons and manuals of instructions, and to the interchange of officers and cadets at technical colleges. It's in the Iron Curtain speech that he coins that phrase, special relationship, that has been so dominant in American-British relations since then. And I might say that criticism of Churchill often includes that privileging that he gives to the English-speaking peoples. That sounds kind of racist or imperialist or, choose your pejorative word to describe it. But he firmly believes that and promotes it even more. And I think the last bit I'll read is more about the United Nations. There is, however, an important question we must ask ourselves. To the skeptics like you maybe in the audience, he says, would a special relationship between the United States and the British Commonwealth be inconsistent with our overriding loyalties to the world organization? That he capitalizes that's the UN. I reply that on the contrary, it is probably the only means by which that organization will achieve its full stature and strength. There are already the special United States relations with Canada, which I have just mentioned, and there are the special relations between the United States and the South American republics. We British have our 20 years treaty of collaboration and mutual assistance with Soviet Russia. I agree with Mr. Bevan, the Foreign Secretary of Great Britain, that it might well be a 50 years treaty so far as we are concerned. We aim at nothing but mutual assistance and collaboration. The British have an alliance with Portugal unbroken since 1384, and which produced fruitful results at critical moments of the war. And he goes on and on. Special associations between members of the United Nations which have no aggressive point against any other country, which harbor no design incompatible with the Charter of the United Nations, far from being harmful, are beneficial and I believe indispensable. So I think you can see why he, in his mind, this address was called The Sinews of Peace. And toward the end, he repeats, this can only be achieved by reaching now in 1946 a good understanding on all points with Russia under the general authority of the United Nations Organization and by the maintenance of that good understanding through many peaceful years by the world instrument supported by the whole strength of the English-speaking world and all its connections. There is the solution which I respectfully offer to you in this address, to which I have given the title, The Sinews of Peace. So I will leave it to you to decide if his recipe for peace in March 1946 was a good one or not, but it was declared here in Missouri and has seemed meaningful to a lot of people ever since then. So thank you. And we are to have time for questions, I think. I'll do my best.
I can project. If I heard you correctly, over and over again, I heard an emphasis on English-speaking countries, and that to me, kind of relegates anybody who's not English speaking to a second class. And that would cause resentment or something like that. Could you comment on that?
Well, I agreed with you a little bit in my aside there. Of course, that Churchill wrote for multi-volume history of the English-speaking peoples. That was his phrase. It does sound old-fashioned to us, if not outwardly racist or hegemonic or something. But in his mind and in the minds of many people at the time, it was those documents that he mentioned, Magna Carta, Bill of Rights, our Declaration of Independence, that really should be the models to the world. And certainly the Declaration of Independence, whether it's in English or not, you may know this, has been there are books written about this, has been a model in more recent terms of those people that don't speak English, who are trying to get out from the yoke of European colonialism in the 50s and 60s, and since then will often use our American Declaration of Independence translated into whatever their language is as a model for their own independence movements. So I admit that it is antiquated in that way, but I think political scientists that you disagree with me would agree that the special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom in the past 69 years, as the British ambassador to the United States was in Fulton in January on the 50th anniversary of Churchill's death, and it's the special relationship isn't as special as it used to be, but the British are still trying to cling, the little British donkey is still trying to have more power than its size of its economy and population would probably merit just on those numbers. But so I agree with you. Interestingly enough, Mikhail Gorbachev, not to keep talking about Fulton, but he came in 1990 and on an American lecture tour after the Soviet Union fell, and his first stop was in Fulton. And I remember that in that speech, he was the first person I remember mentioning that the permanent members of the Security Council should be expanded. And what I particularly remember is he mentioned countries like India and Brazil. The other parts of the BRIC are already permanent members, but I thought that was interesting that he, the former leader of the Soviet Union, was in Fulton, suggesting a wider view of the world that wasn't just English speaking. Of course, the permanent members speak lots of languages other than English, but so I think that in 1990 showed how far the thinking had come. But Churchill is persistent about the heritage of the English-speaking peoples, whether you like it or not. He thought it was very important and was the glue that held a lot of this together.
Do you know where we are with self-determination as far as how the UN has developed that, and if it's anywhere near?
I'm not probably the person to talk about right now, but in the 70 years since the formation of the UN, of course, it's been a constant, source of international conflict. And it was at the time, coming out of Potsdam, Potsdam Conference, Stalin and Churchill and Truman, one of the big arguments was how do we enforce the Yalta Conference, and that's self-determination for Poland and the Baltic, the countries that the Yalta Conference had pledged self-determination toward, but the Soviet Union was already ignoring that. So from the beginning, that bit of the Atlantic Charter, and I think self-determination goes back even to Wilson's 14 points, after World War I, and beyond that. So it has been from what I know, it has been a constant source of debate and a principle not perfectly executed. Another slam on Churchill is after World War I and the drawing of the Middle Eastern map that the British did. And, we're suffering, some people would say, the consequences of those actions, which were not self-deterministic, but just drawing lines on a map and ignoring ethnic populations and so forth. So it has not been a perfect.
Did Churchill continue to speak publicly on international affairs after 1946, or was that kind of his swan song?
Well, no, he did. He was out of office. He was a member of Parliament, but he became Prime Minister again in 1950, and was until 1955. So he did come back. Johnson over there just mentioned me earlier. Churchill's visit to Washington at the last month of the Truman administration. The talk there was a lot about the hydrogen bomb and that sort of thing. And late in that phase, American relations with the UK, one of the issues that flared up was the Iraqi oil crisis, they called it. So there were a lot of international issues that he was involved in. But as Prime Minister, he had a platform in that, so that most of his speeches in the early 50s were in Parliament. And then, of course, after he left Parliament, or after he left being Prime Minister, he sort of faded into the world history those last 10 years or so. Fulton and Zurich, I think, are seen as the peak of his later life, post-World War II notoriety and influence.
So Churchill and Truman are very colorful characters, maybe Churchill in particular.
Mm-hmm.
Did the personality of these men and leaders like Eleanor Roosevelt, two women, did they reflect in the organization itself that they created?
I would certainly agree with the first statement and the first part of the statement that they were colorful and they became friends. It was on the 1,000-mile train trip from Washington to Jefferson City that they really cemented their friendship because they really didn't know each other all that well. And they both talked about it. It was that trip that they agreed to be on a first-name basis. I don't see signs. Truman. I don't know that Truman had much of a role. He had time to really. He was dealing with Roosevelt's leftover cabinet. The conference was already planned, and so I don't think with the UN Charter that he necessarily had influence in the drafting of it, other than hoping that it would. And I think he sent Eleanor Roosevelt to be a kind of public figure of support. But of course, Truman, with the Korean conflict, I think his personality showed of how he handled that situation, not going single-handedly to war, but trying to use the United Nations that way. So I think that's a good question. Off the top of my head, I don't see personalities injected in the document itself. But certainly they're both trying to, Churchill, as you just heard, trying to shape how the UN would develop, and they hope succeed. And then Truman in a much more immediate way with Korea of using it as the way he saw it intended to be in the Charter.